Hola.
Hola?
Hello, can you all hear me? So hello and good morning, thanks for being here, thanks to the 42, and thanks to the amazing authors here in the podium. I'm sure you know them, but I'm going to briefly introduce them. Giovanni Nucci from Italy. He understands Spanish, but we're going to be speaking slowly so he can understand us. He's an author of adult narrative, last book. He's specialized in Greek and Roman myth. Maite Carranza from Barcelona. She's published more than 60 books, the last one entitled La Loba Gris, which is the prior to La Saga de las Brujas, Kristoff from Australia. He's also an author of adult and youth narrative, and I would like to ask you to give them a warm applause. Thank you. So I would like to start this debate with you, and the first question, which is the title of the debate, is: do you believe that young people do not like reality anymore? Why are they so fascinated by fantasy? Should I start? Please, go ahead. Considering that I'm a local, I have this privilege. So I believe that when one is a teenager, when one starts this transit from childhood to the adult age, well, one goes through new experiences, willingness to discover new things. It's an adventure. And I believe fantasy brings all these elements, right? Includes all these elements that young people look forward to discover new worlds that they had previously existed, right? With the big travelers, when in the planet there was still room and places to discover. But today, considering that, well, today fantasy, science fiction allows us to travel even farther to the future, to the past, towards parallel realities. And I believe this is always very thought-provoking. I don't think young people don't like the world in which they live. Well, I don't like the world in which I live, to be honest. I don't know about young people because each generation is different. But I believe this desire to think about other realities is very much related to the age in which one wants to break with one's past. And I believe Giovanni will tell us much more about this. Humanity, all cultures, all communities have always believed in myth, in fantasy, and in magics. And this has been a way to somehow explain reality. We interpret reality through magics. And this is the grounds on which all cultures and societies are built upon. Myths, religion respond to big human questions. But here's the expert.
If the question is why people don't like reality, the answer is because the reality is disgusting. And now, especially in this age, the reality is really disgusting.
Yeah, that is worst.
Yes, and for the question she gave me, the myth, the mythology, is not, and also I think the fantasy, fantastic literature, is not escape from the reality. It's not refuge. But is indeed the myth is the hands in the myth and or in the fantastic literature. We find the answer because the reality is disgusting, and in mythology we are an hero and a monster. And the monster is not necessarily enormous man with only one eye. But the I don't know a dictator, un dittatore. Dictator is a man, enormous man with only one eye. He see the thing, the reality with one prospection.
Un aspetto.
Un solo punto di vista. Sì. No? And so the way with, I don't know, Ulysses kill the Cyclope is the way who we can oppose a dictator. So in mythology we looking for all the answer, all the way to, and I think the fiction and fantastic fiction is a proseguimento, uno sviluppo, un development of the first mythology and organization of mental organization of the reality.
Bueno, la mitología.
Indeed, mythology has always been there, and it's still very present, very timely, because it connects with very universal and human values. And probably this is why it's very present in fantasy, right? So again, Jay, the first question, maybe you have forgotten it, so I'm gonna do a short refresh. Do you think young people are not interested in reality? Young and not that young, because some of us are not that young and we don't like reality either.
First of all, it's great to see you all. Thank you for coming. It's awesome to travel halfway around the world and see so many friendly faces. Can we give a round of applause to our amazing translator, who is doing an incredible job? I think different people read for different reasons. Some young people find the world very scary. It's understandable. The world is a very scary place right now. And it seems to be getting scarier every day, and I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with seeking a place to escape, even if only for a moment, and alleviate the pressures that you feel under every single day, because the world is a terrible place. If you spend too much time on social media, you'll be convinced that the world is ending. But I think the role of myth, fantasy, has always been and continues to be the idea that individual people can make a difference. That even in the darkest time, in the grimmest place, facing the most frightening monster, you and you and you can make a difference, make the world a better place. There's that great, I think it's G.C. Chesterton quote, I'm going to mangle it terribly, but it's something like, we tell stories not to prove that dragons exist, but to prove that they can be beaten. We don't tell stories about monsters to frighten you. We tell stories about monsters because the world is a frightening place, but heroes overcome monsters by living up to heroic ideals, by getting pushed out of the Shire into the big scary land, to go and drop the ring into the mountain of fire, to put out the eye of the Cyclops, because even though he seems big and frightening, the thing that makes him monstrous also makes him weak. He only has one eye. So if you put out that one eye, if you blind that single perspective and open up a wider view of the world, that's his weakness. That's the way you beat him. So yeah, even though fantasy can seem on the surface to be an escape, I don't think that's the role that it's playing, at least in the stories that I tell, and presumably my colleagues as well. We tell stories about monsters to prove that monsters can be beaten.
Habéis comentado la figura del...
So you've referred to the idea of monster, and I would like to ask you about monsters. Oftentimes monsters have been considered as terrible, terrifying, scary, but lately in fantasy we tend to speak about the human character of monsters, as it was the case with Frankenstein a long time ago. But there is a clear pattern towards humanizing monsters. And there's also a lot of sagas in which there is a certain, gossip and interminglement between humankind and monsters, where there is where there is an interaction between monsters and humankind. And why do you think today young people and those of us who are not that young are eager to empathize with monsters, to have like a more human approach on monsters?
Maite es la que rompe el hielo.
Sí.
Maite, would you like to break the ice? So I believe there are different reasons why this happens, and there are different reasons, different triggers. Pure Manichaeism, this dichotomy between good and evil, is boring, is too boring. Of course, it's a basic scheme in order to come up with a script, but nuance is what makes a history unique. And it's precisely in nuance when monsters become terrible, or when humankind feel all of a sudden attracted for this evilness, because I believe ambiguity makes lives interesting and makes characters interesting. We all have dark parts, we all have shadows, and when we see that some heroes also have a hidden dark side, it is a way to say, listen, we're all human. Heroes and also monsters can have a human side. This has been widely explored in the genre, and of course, as you mentioned, there is a general pattern to claim the dark side of monsters, of course, and the human side of monsters, and somehow perhaps not analyzing monsters, but at least trying to understand them deeply, in depth. So I believe this really enriches the genre and makes it much more interesting, because the dichotomy again between good and bad is boring. And it's interesting to see if heroes are going to be pure all the way until the end of the history or if they will break in the journey. And I believe this makes it fascinating.
In the Milan Kundera, the great writer, said that literature stage all the possibility of existence. And I think the mythology stage all the possibility of unconscious. And so the monster is inside. And the stage one monster is keep out. And the problem in mythology, the difference is who the hero kills the monster. The difference from various heroes, Ulisse or Achille or Perseo or Hercules, is a different way to kill, and so to confront, to understand the monster, and so have a reaction of the monster. I mean, and this is a way to understand the reality, the disgusting reality.
El mundo, la realidad es...
So again, reality is disgusting. I agree with you 100%.
The child in the classroom. For explain the actuality of the myth, I talk about the myth of Cyclope, Ulysses and Cyclope, and said the Cyclope is the same thing of your teacher. And when the teacher give an interrogation, no, and looking for someone to interrogate, and if you on the first time said, "What's your name?" Your answer is nessuno. In Italian, I don't know in English what's the name of Ulisse. Nothing is nothing. No, no, ma capite? When the teacher looking for someone to make the integration and say, today we listen nessuno. Nothing, no? And this is a way to react to have not normal, not usual reaction of the normal life, but another stage.
Yeah, I mean, usually in their origins, monsters are a way for humans to explore the darker parts of ourselves. Frankenstein was a story about the cost of unchecked scientific development, the hubris of the scientist who thinks he can take the place of God. Werewolves are a cautionary tale about allowing the animalistic side of human nature to rule you. Vampires are about unbridled sexuality, essentially. So in their origin stories, they tend to be cautionary tales warning us against the darker sides of our nature. But as storytelling has developed and as we as humans have become used to those ideas, they become more nuanced because black and white is boring, good and evil is boring. The most interesting stories to tell are the ones that you find in shades of grey. So that's why you start to see these monsters adopted and become more humanized to tell stories through their eyes, or at least in their proximity. So they're not just enemies, but you can see them as people who have just lost themselves into darkness, for example. So vampires have stopped becoming outsiders and have started becoming, romantic anti-heroes and love interests because we've told the stories about black and white, and telling stories about them in a more nuanced way is more interesting, at least to me as a storyteller. So it's cool to see those myths taken by new writers and evolved and changed in different ways. It's really exciting.
Los personajes grises son más divertidos.
Absolutely. Grey characters are very much fascinating. So you, as writers, you have explored different genres. Has it ever happened to you to get in touch with an editorial company and, sometimes they place your book in the juvenile section because it's a fantasy book? Do you think there is still this wrong idea of fantasy belonging to the juvenile genre? I think Jay is looking forward to answer to this question.
Readers often I wrote a series called Nevernight, which booksellers often find confusing. The protagonist is a teenage girl, she's 16 at the start of the series, and she's on the cover. So typically speaking, if you were to grab any book in a bookstore where the protagonist was a 16-year-old girl, you would probably be right to assume that it's a young adult novel. But Nevernight is not a young adult novel. It's very serious and bloody and has a lot of explicit content. And I've been very clear from the start that it's not YA, and my American publisher is not a young adult publisher. But readers send me pictures of Nevernight in the YA section all the time just to annoy me, which is something. But yeah, I think it's not an unreasonable expectation, for example, if you were to pick up a book that had a teenage female protagonist, that it's young adult. In my case, it isn't. But yeah, I think genre fiction has always been ghettoized, so to speak. It's looked down upon by more serious writers and more serious literary establishment. It is seen as juvenile, but I think that's a very limited perspective. I think my favorite stories have always been in the realm of fantasy, and I think fantasy plays a really important role in teaching us about ourselves in ways that are perhaps less direct. I write science fiction as well. You can tell a story in a future setting about green-skinned people being cruel to people with blue skin. That is ultimately still a story about racism. It's about a conflict between cultures. But when you tell that story divorced from the actual conflicts that are going on in the world right now, you can perhaps apply a different perspective because emotions aren't running so high. You're dealing with fantastical elements, make-believe elements. And so perhaps you can look at issues that affect us in the real world with less emotion and more rational thought. So I think it plays a really important role. The idea that it's juvenile is, it's a limited perspective that I don't agree with.
Maite o Giovanni?
Bueno, yo creo que
So I haven't had this experience because I write for a young audience, so there is no possible confusion there. But I believe that in Spain and in Anglo-Saxon countries, there's an important difference between Spain and Anglo-Saxon countries and the importance of genres in both settings. In Spain, for quite a long time, we've been victims of that. Those who write black and science fiction, we were considered as sub-genre writers, and as such, we were kept far away from the media focus, and we were considered quite mainstream, poor quality, popular authors, and sometimes we were even considered bestsellers, but in a negative way. And I believe that we're now claiming the normality of genres thanks to initiatives like the 42 Festival, the ANGLès Festival, and the incorporation of young generations who do not make such a split between what's literature and what's sub-literature. So thanks for contributing to normalizing the genre. Anglo-Saxons have been much more clever. Since the inception of the genre, they have always dignified all forms of literature. I believe this is a very Latino, let's say, approach to say, oh, this is not literature. I don't know if my colleagues share my views. I believe this is a very, local answer, the one I've given. Even the approach, the press gives us, the attention we get from the press is quite weird because, we have quite a lot of followers and the press does not really pay much attention to us.
The genre literature is a sub-literature, and the juvenile literature, and especially juvenile genre literature, is sub literature, but is the bestseller. I don't know in other world, but in Italy the bestseller is always the juvenile and genre. I think the genre or not genre of a book is a question of the ability of the writer. The author is a great author, and she writes, I don't know, the Metamorphosis of Kafka. We can write a genre book, but the difference is in how you write this story. And so the classification is a commercial classification, is a way who the publisher or the bookseller use is a right way, is normal, is necessary to have, for a bookseller is necessary to know if is a good book for a child 8 years or a person who loves the vampires. No? But is a commercial question. The literary question is a good book or a not good book. We are a lot of not good book of genre or not genre. So I think is yes, it's only an economical question.
Queda poco tiempo, no sé.
Oh my gosh, time flies. We're almost running out of time. So I'm going to ask you a few more questions and then we're going to open the Q&A what differences do you believe one can see between today's fantasy and the fantasy you read when you were teenagers? Or perhaps you didn't read that much fantasy back then, but, you know, what's the difference between today and what you read when you were teenagers? I'm the older one here in the room, not in the room, but in the podium at least, so my reference were really poor compared to the absolute variety of authors and references today. So I was inspired mainly by the classics, Bradbury, Dune, Asimov. So yeah, classical novels that would open the reader's eyes to a world of opportunities, but not like today. Today I have no time to read. Everything is written, and I'm always surprised by new approaches, new ways of interpreting the world. I'm always surprised with the vast proposals today. Of course, today there's much more blood than in the books I read when I was a young girl. More sex, of course. In the past, it was difficult to read about sex. It was very wide, so to speak. Romance. Romance is à la mode today in order to give books with a more, you know, fragile and human touch. And from here on, all possible combinations, all possible hybrids. And this is what makes today literature panorama so rich. And generation after generation, new voices are included that imbricate contributions from the past with current ones. I'm fascinated by fantasy and science fiction. I'm speaking here about science, fiction, and fantasy. What about you guys?
But I think that the myth have exists even before people started to talking, and also Homero take this story and tell, and so is always. The fiction or the narration of myth is out of time in one way, and so it's really difficult to say that if the Odyssey of Homero is most important of the Ulysses of Joyce. And so they talk about the same history in one way. So the difference in Italy, in the child's juvenile tale of mythology, if the writer is more free. When I started 25 years ago, the first book of mythology who I write, the publisher said me, well, you can talk about the myth if you prefer, but you don't use sexual scene and violent scene. And I read the mythology is only sexual scene and only violent scene. In some time there are, a lot of time there are sexual and violent scene in the same. So now is in Italy.
Today it's the other way around, right?
And when I write I hope I have the capacity to explain. But when I write the book of Ulysses, I spoke about the aviation of Urano. And is a real, also if is a book for 10 years old boys and girls, but is a very important affair. And I said, in what way I can tell this this story is who is really deeper and important, and but for me it's important to not scandalize in a way is good for a boy of 10 years. And I write this paragraph, I don't know, 10 times. At the end I write, I said in Italian, Urano tagliò il pisello, anzi Crono tagliò il pisello ad Urano. No? Crono is the song, cat, pisello is the pisello. In the way most simple, it worked very well. And when I go in the classroom, the boy all the time, you have right, pisello, in your book. He's very happy.
For me, I kind of grew up reading the classics the same as you, so I was a big fan of fantasy when I was a young man, and those stories tended to be more simplistic in terms of the morality. There was always a Dark Lord, and there was always a band of heroes, and the heroes would go on a journey and eventually defeat evil. So the morality of them was very simplistic. I think today's fantasy authors tend to play in those shades of grey. I remember the first time that I read Game of Thrones, and spoilers incoming, but the hero at the end of that book, the guy you think is the hero, Ned Stark, he gets his head cut off, which is not the way that fantasy was supposed to go. The hero was supposed to beat the evil king, and the good guys were supposed to win, and that was the first time I read a book that taught me that, oh, sometimes the hero doesn't get to win. Sometimes bad people come out on top. And I think as a result of that kind of thinking, fantasy has become far more interesting, and you're seeing the rise of anti-heroes and bad people who get drawn back into the light, stories about redemption, stories about good people doing bad things for good reasons. The fantasy genre has become a lot more complex, and I think that can only be a good thing. Science fiction less so. I mean, science fiction is always, to my mind, it's an attempt to explore the problems of the present through the lens of futurism. So the problems that we're looking at in today's science fiction are different to the problems that we were facing 40 years ago. 40 years ago, we were worried about nuclear proliferation and overpopulation and interplanetary exploration, whereas nowadays science fiction tends to be slightly different in tone because the world in which it's being written is different and the problems are different. But yeah, one of my favourite science fiction novels ever is a book called Neuromancer by a writer named William Gibson. And the opening line, this is, I think it was written in 1982, and the first line of the book is, "The sky above the port was the colour of a television tuned to a dead channel." Now, if you grew up in the 1980s, when you turned on your television and the channel was dead, you would get static across the screen. It was grey. So it was a really arty way of saying that the sky over the port was grey. But nowadays, we all have digital televisions, and when you turn on a digital TV to a dead channel, it's blue. So the greatest opening line, in my opinion, in the greatest science fiction book ever read, if you look at it through a modern lens now, it just says the sky over the port was blue. That's a big deal. So the lens through which we're examining the problems has shifted slightly. But yeah, storytelling has become more complex because of the groundwork laid by all those great writers of the past. So everything that's being told today is being built on the shoulders of those great storytellers. So we owe them all of that.
So when you write for a young audience, do you, let's say, repress yourself when it comes to speaking about cruel events, or do you think it's the relevant forum where to do so? Well, one of the pros of fantasy and science fiction is that, you know, they are very permissive genres where you can speak about whatever in whatever way. This is a very personal experience. I've written in a humoristic way. Humor is a very interesting way to speak about difficult topics. Now, when it comes to realism, well, realism is much more limited. There's a lot of censorship. Editorial companies censor quite a lot in realism, and there is much more control by parents' organization and WhatsApp groups, etc. They should ban parents' groups. And, you know, oftentimes there is a lack of attention in what is said in fantasy. For example, in this witch novel, well, of course, if you say it's about witches, parents are not worried anymore. They don't want to censor you anymore. Well, in fact, in the first chapter, I dared speaking about the difficult thing. I start as follows. I start with an ill treatment that a 4-year-old girl is the testimony of. The father is literally beating the hell out of the mother, and the girl can see it, the daughter can see it. In some realistic novels, this would be censored. But in fact, you know, when it's a fantasy book, I wasn't censored. So it seems like in magic, in science fiction, you can touch many different topics freely. There is a lesbian relationship in this book, for example, whereas in other genres, perhaps this would not be accepted. I believe it's a very flexible genre. I love it. I was so surprised with the War of the Witches that we published with Laura Gallego. She published her trilogy, Idun's Memories, and we published, both of us, in the same period. We became very good friends, and I told Laura, I can't believe it. A novel of yours has been published in a very religious editorial company with a threesome, and the book finishes with a threesome because the dragon was also a centaurus and a unicorn. So, you know, this is a threesome, you know. The book finishes with a threesome, and the church published it. The church. Thanks, Laura, for your brilliant idea. Wow, this polyamorous threesome with children from 2 different fathers. This can only happen in science fiction. I believe these people do not even read our books before they publish them. You know, if you want to speak to the young, use science fiction or fantasy. It's a way to speak about whatever you like, believe me.
Because the plot of the mythology exists, and I put time, and the difficulty is the way and understand what mean these, not explain, but if I understand who the I don't know, the Cyclope is a dictator, I write the story in this way. And so also for the violence of all the situation is I meet some publisher who don't like some, but is also I think the power of literature is especially to use a right way to say the thing. And if you are a good writer, you use the right way.
Yeah, I think writing is hard enough without censoring yourself before you get your words down onto the page. no matter who your audience might be. I write for adults and young adults, so I bring different sensibilities to both, but I try not to censor anything before I get it down onto the page. I think young readers these days are more literate than any generation ever. They read voraciously, and I think they can sense if you're talking down to them, if you're not talking to them like they're adults. So yeah, I think the best thing that an author can do is be honest, speak authentically, tell the story that they want to tell, and not fear too much about the consequences. I write for the American market, and Americans can sometimes be a little puritanical. Apologies if there's any Americans in the audience today. So there are certain things that I won't say in my young adult books, but the second Nevernight book starts with a threesome, if that counts for anything. But yeah, I think you have to be honest as an author and tell the story that you want to tell, and worry about offending people later.
Queda poquito.
So again, we are running almost out of time, so it's the perfect moment to open the Q&A session, and there is one right there. Microphone, please. Hello, and I would like to ask something very specific to Giovanni. You said that in Italy, like in Spain, fantasy and science fiction are a sub-category or sub-genre. Has Italo Calvino played an impact in literature in Italy, considering that he approached fantasy and science fiction in many of his books, and he is a great writer? Has Italo Calvino been, let's say, an influence in Italy and in science fiction and in fantasy in particular?
I think it's a mystery. I don't know why. But we have the most important writer, children writer of the world, Collodi, Pinocchio. And also the children literature, or Rodaghi, Gianni Rodaghi. Also in Italy, the children's literature is a B category. And now we have the celebrity of the born of Calvino, 100 anni, and all people talk about Calvino, all the newspaper talk about, but the most, I think the most important books of Calvino is the trilogy of Barone Rampante, Cavaliere, and is a child book, a juvenile literature, fantastic fantasy literature, but nobody talk about the fantastic literature as the most, or one of most important way to use literature. There are Kafka, we are Borges, we are Melville. Is this plain, this livello, no? Di altezza della letteratura. But I think because in Italy now all the writer, the must know writer, he write the realism literature, but very simple. And so the opposition
¿Ha respondido a la pregunta? ¿Alguna más por ahí?
Hello. Does fantasy somehow allow to speak about what cannot be said publicly? And don't you think that today's reality is even more fantastic than the genre? For example, the viruses in the 20th century were developed in labs. The conflict that started a year ago, we thought that the bad actor was not the bad actor, and now Israelis have come up with an excuse to attack Palestine. Now, sometimes I have the feeling that today's reality is more fantastic than the genre itself. In a recent conference where they would speak about non-identified flying objects, they have come to the conclusion that we're speaking about another race, that actually they are a different race. But all this, of course, is not said publicly. It can be said only in fantasy. What do you think about this?
Bueno, existe esa frase.
Of course, it's oftentimes said that reality overcomes fiction. What I can say as a writer and as a script writer, because of course in script writing one has to take this into account also, is that sometimes I have to somehow downgrade reality, especially when it's very utopic, because no one will believe what I say. For something to be believed by the writer, sometimes we have to downgrade the tone of reality. But I learned this a long time ago, because many times here in Spain it's like, no, I'm never going to believe this, when in fact you are speaking about a real event. If I want to speak about a very, striking event, I triple check it before, like in the housemaid tale. The author says it's very realistic. Everything that I tell in the series has happened. So what happens in this series has happened in the past. Of course, it's a melting pot of real events. And, I believe, or at least what I do in my work as a writer and as a scriptwriter, I try to downgrade reality sometimes, because otherwise no one will ever believe it. Of course, we are petty thieves of real ideas that then we reinterpret, but our inspiration is not the result of us drinking too much. You just need to read the press with your eyes wide open to, get inspired about incredible real events. And even more today. I cannot think about any specific event today, but every day I think about 3 real events and I'm like, no, I can't believe this is true.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Creo que había por aquí. Vale, luego aquí que hay, esta chica lleva un rato.
She's been waiting for a while. Hello. Now regarding what you mentioned before, and well, about fantasy being somehow undermined in Spain and in Italy compared to the Anglo-Saxon world, I'm wondering if there is a background reason which has to do with the literary tradition in both worlds. Here in Spain, there is quite a vast realism tradition, and when in a classic work fantasy is included, oftentimes it's in a humoristic way, as if the writer was crazy, whereas in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, there are the Arthurian myth that date from a long time ago. Do you think this is one of the reasons behind the literary tradition in both worlds? Is this a way to understand why genres are very differently developed in both worlds?
In Spagna avete Cervantes. che è fantastico. I think the problem is when you confront from a bigger, really bigger writer is also for the same thing that the actual writer, Italian writer, to confront with Calvino is very difficult. And so confront with Cervantes, Don Quixote is like a fantastic, fantasy literature is very difficult. And we don't forget this thing.
Bueno, yo creo que sí, que hay una tradición diferenciada.
Well, I believe there is a different tradition between Anglo-Saxon and Mediterranean and Hispanic traditions, as well as Italic traditions. But this does not justify the situation today, no matter how you want to justify it. Here in Catalonia, for example, a lot has been written about the absurd, poetry, magic poetry. There's Pere Caldés, an amazing author. And besides that, one continues to look at fantasy. I believe this is the result of the old-fashioned and lack of, let's say, mental scope here in Spain. Of course, Cervantes was very much accepted by the bourgeois, but otherwise we've had amazing authors that have gone unnoticed. Torrente Ballester, many people do not even know him. Read him, Torrente Ballester, he's amazing. If we lived in an Anglo-Saxon world, he would be a hero, whereas here he's totally unknown and adverted. But there is a certain national feeling here in Spain, old-fashioned, imperialist, that somehow predisposes some people to catalog as being less important what is not realistic. And we're speaking about white gentlemen that publish honorable articles in newspapers criticizing literature. I believe there's one last question here in the front row. Hello, I have a general question to you all, knowing that you all work in different markets. What element is a must to come up with a good fantasy work? In the Spanish market, my perception is that there are excellent authors, excellent novels, but yet we are very much somehow invaded by the international market. What's the key ingredient to be successful in each of your markets? I will let them speak because I've been speaking all the time.
I don't know, speaking as the invader. I've been very fortunate to see my work translated. I think I've published in about 35 different countries now. In terms of what makes my writing different from others, I honestly can't answer that question because I only have my perspective to speak from. I try and root my stories in human truths. I try and tell stories about basic human emotions, but I also try and create a world that people haven't seen before. And it can be pretty daunting because that's an incredible amount of fantasy that's been published over the course of human history. So trying to think of something original is pretty difficult, but I try and create one fundamental difference in the worlds that I create and build everything around that one fundamental difference. So for example, in Life Like It's a post-apocalyptic story where artificial humanoids have been created. That's the one point of difference between this world and the world that I've created in the books. In Aurora Rising, we're an interstellar species that has crossed galactic distances and met different alien races. We've got off the Earth and we're discovering a wider universe. But ultimately, there's still stories about family and friendship and courage and the idea that the individual can make a difference, even in a big, dark, scary universe. But insofar as what makes my books more palatable to international audiences as opposed to books published here in Spain, I honestly don't know. I don't have the perspective of a Spanish author or a Spanish reader. So why do you think that it's more difficult for a Spanish reader to break into the American market than, say, it is for an American author to break into Spain? I don't know.
El mercado inglés.
Well, the Anglo-Saxon market is closed. It's, closed. What's true for those of us who write in Spanish or in Catalan is that it's very difficult to penetrate the Anglo-Saxon market. You know, Anglo-Saxon writers do not translate from other languages. They are translated, but not the other way around. So it's the best-selling market. But what's interesting is to know that it's not like European authors are poor. It's just that the door is shut. There is a border. There are no translations into English of European works. Very little. In the London Fair, they realized a couple of years ago, they realized that in the juvenile category, there was, well, perhaps the US is a little bit more open, and I don't know about Australia, but British, English boys and girls would not read authors that were not English, nor French, Italians, nothing. So the door is closed, and publishers, they launch a public call to translate 2 works. 2! So there was a public tender, there was a public award with 240 candidates, and only 2 of them were chosen. Only 2 were the lucky ones, a Swedish and a German, I believe. So it's very different. Markets are very different. We're speaking about a closed market, an isolated market that expands. It's colonialism, imperialism. This is the way you call it. So again, it's very difficult for us to be in the international scenario. And again, it has to be said also that our tradition is much younger than the Anglo-Saxon tradition. Of course, they have an advantage. Bear in mind that we experience a dictatorship. So of course, culturally speaking, we are running far behind Anglo-Saxon countries and other European countries. Nonetheless, I believe we have been able to, accelerate thanks to new voices and the inclusion of women in fantasy and science fiction. So again, I believe the rules of the game need to be revisited, and it has been said, he said that friendship, family, emotions, at the end of the day, are the topics that prevail. And this novel, for example, is a trilogy that was translated into 30 languages because it speaks about something very human, witchcraft, the feminine power that all cultures share, and this reluctance towards powerful women. This happens in all cultures in the world. This lack of trust for clever women. So this is a universal topic. Why some are successful and others don't? Well, I believe that the human element is very important and is one of the recipes for success. Not to speak about betrayal, love, friendship, family. Family is very important. Family is the bomb.com. Family is where you can find all the terrible snakes in humanity. So the conflicting relationships between gods and their partners. This is the ingredient for success. Fantasy novels are accepted universally when they speak about these topics. Well, not all of them, but many. And one has to bear in mind also that Anglo-Saxon literature is powerful. They have the money, they have the influence, and of course they have amazing authors like him. But again, there is a parallel reality. There is a parallel reality. For us Spaniards, it's much more difficult to be successful. I love the debate. I'm loving it, but I'm being told off almost. We've got to leave it here. This could go on forever for me. But once again, thanks for coming. Thanks to the audience. Thanks to the 42. And don't run away, because there will be a closing concert. Please rush to the concert. And first, buy the books and ask for a signature. Thank you.